And I'm here today with Professor Benito Alaez Corral of the University of Oviedo in Spain. And today we're going to discuss Spanish constitutional law as part of our video interview series at iConnect. Benito, thanks very much for joining us today.
Hi, Richard. Thank you to you.
So, Benito, let's begin. What are the major issues in Spanish constitutional law today?
Well, there are a lot of issues in Spanish constitutional law, not only today, but in our constitutional history. Our constitutional history is full of constitutional, let's say, events, although we do not enjoy it in the last 200 years a very strong constitutional movement. And some of the issues and events that we have experienced in the past are repeated today in today's situation. But let me focus in three main issues that are the main concerns that the Spanish society has today. The first one is the territorial organization issue. And its main reflections nowadays are the referendum proposal in Catalonia and the secessionist ambitions in some parts of Spain, like Catalonia or the Basque Country. The second issue is the redefinition of the scope of social rights that has been taking place since the beginning of the economic crisis. The weakening of some social rights, such as, for instance, the right to health, the right to education, the right to social protection in situations of need, linked to the state's budget cuttings and to the consideration of those social rights not as rights, as fundamental rights as such, but as mere state goals, clashes with the aims of part of the Spanish society that this does not happen and that those social rights are entrenched as real fundamental rights. And the third one, related to the second one and to the economic crisis, is the crisis of the Spanish parliamentarian democracy. And it is reflected in the social perception of the bad quality of the democratic representative institutions, because mainly of political corruption cases, the bad functioning of the Spanish electoral system, and the lack of transparency of the institution, and especially a strong bipartisan control of the political system. And if we look to all these three elements, all around them appears the constitutional amendment as a way to face them. But the issue is that it's not politically an easy task.
There's a lot to talk about. Let's begin with the constitutional implications of the referendum proposal and the secessionist ambitions of Catalonia. Would you discuss that subject?
Okay. The issue is the following. In order to exercise a claimed right to self-determination of the Catalonian people, the Catalonian government has called, a few days ago, a consultation which should take place next November the 9th, about whether the citizenry in Catalonia wants to become a state, first question, and if so, second question, whether this state must become an independent one. It must be remarked that the Catalonia government does not want to name this consultation referendum, even though we talk about it as referendum, because of the legal implications of doing this. According to the Spanish Constitutional Court, referenda can only be called, even by autonomous regions, when authorized by the national government, and this one has already publicly rejected to authorize it. And it is also worthy to note that the questions to be asked in the consultation, the two ones I mentioned before, though not binding, both deal with the issue of the national unity and the type of the constitutional territorial organization of the country. And the Constitutional Court also has stated in 2008, regarding a similar case in the Basque Country, that as long as such consultations have to do with those issues, they are a matter of constitutional amendment and can only be decided through a referendum of the whole Spanish people. Furthermore, the national government has challenged the consultation before the Constitutional Court using a type of federal preemption clause, and the Constitutional Court has suspended the consultation cautionary 2 days ago for an initial term of 5 months, and any institution infringing the suspension could be charged with the crime of disobedience. I hope we do not have to call the militia, as the US Constitution provides for. But the issue is that some Catalonian forces do not recognize the Constitutional Court as legitimate constitutional referee, and they threaten with civil disobedience. So the atmosphere is a very tensioned atmosphere, a very political tension atmosphere, and it is uncertain what is going to happen.
Let's move on to the discussion of social rights. How is Spain addressing the tension between the promise of realizing social rights and the reality of increasing financial pressures on the state?
To be honest, the last two Spanish cabinets, as well the Conservative now, as previously the Social Democrats, have decided to accept the recommendations, the so-called recommendations of the financial regulators, and have given up, or at least reduced, the scope of many social rights, remaining tied to the strict requirements of budgetary balance and public debt reduction established by the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Commission. A clear proof of this was the 2010 amendment of the Spanish Constitution. Very easy, agreed with easy bipartisan agreement, in which it was constitutionalized these financial requirements as already required by some European Union member states, such as Germany. However, a vast part of the Spanish society does not understand the cuttings in many social rights, especially those basic social rights, such as public education, healthcare, or social protection in basic needs, and does not understand either the governmental financial help to the public banking system, which instead of reducing the public debt, has increased this public debt. As a result of all these, let's say, tension, a new left-wing political party, curiously called We Can, has picked up this anchor of many citizens and threatens to reach the governmental institutions and fight against this policy. Indeed, the polls, the opinion polls, give to them good 15% of the seats in parliament.
Well, let's talk about Parliament, since you've ended with that institution. Is Parliament viewed as a legitimate institution capable of addressing these very serious problems in Spain?
Yes and no. We would say that yes, it is still a legitimate institution, but it needs some changes in the settings of politics. Politics and politicians are in Spain highly discredited because of the many corruption cases that arise and arise and arise every day, and also because of the very difficult decisions taken to manage the economic crisis. Opinion polls, in this sense, show that in the last years, politicians are seen as one of the major social problems after disemployment and the economic difficulties derived from the crisis. And of course, this has its reflection in the trust of the society in the parliament to address these and other challenges we are facing now. In this sense, although some action can be taken by the parliament to address these challenges and recover the legitimacy of politics, for instance, regarding some aspects of the electoral system, or regarding achieving more transparency of politics, or eliminating some bridges between politics and finance and economy, as long as most of those challenges have to do with some privileges of the same politicians responsible for enacting them, it is unlikely that they are going to do it, at least in this legislature. And as I told before, this has led to a strong uprising of a new left-wing political party, We Can. And this party is expected to play a relevant role in the next general election in 2015 and could help to open the door to the needed changes, of course, depending on the concrete electoral results.
So these are three very, very big problems that you've mentioned, and I wonder how Spain will ever solve them. Is constitutional amendment, formal constitutional amendment, a viable option?
It is difficult to say, because the solutions to these problems have much to do with more civic democratic culture, with the lack of civic democratic culture in my country. And reaching more civic democratic culture takes some time. And that this culture become widespread, first in the society and then in political institutions, take more and more time. Of course, constitutional amendment is a normative way to improve the aspects of our constitutional system which do not enhance enough this civic democratic culture, and it's a viable option. And in this sense, and from the point of view of the constitutional theory, Spain considers itself a non-militant democracy, where there are no absolute substantial limitations upon constitutional amendment. So everything can be amended, from the territorial integrity to the type of democracy we are. But we live in a very polarized society and a bipartisan political system. And in this political system, it is almost impossible now to reach the required compromise for a constitutional amendment, especially taking into account that our constitution is a strongly entrenched constitution. In this sense, conservatives and social democrats are in some of the controversial issues we have mentioned up to now, for instance, the territorial organization issue or the welfare state issue, too much divided to reach an agreement. And in other issues where they could be much closer, such for instance some changes in the parliamentarian democracy, they had not the will to amend the system that worked for their political interests for a long time, even though they knew that it was not fair.
What about non-constitutional solutions? Could there be a way of solving one or more of these problems without a constitutional amendment?
Yes, partially this is possible, but the question is whether this is desirable or this would be desirable. Let's take the three issues. The territorial issue. Of course, the central government could try to expand more the autonomy of Catalonia or the Basque Country, let's say to shut their mouth. But the level of political autonomy they already enjoy is quite big compared to other federal countries, is over the average of many federal states in the world. So an increased autonomy, especially if this autonomy is increased in financial matters, could endanger the sustainability of the national state functioning and even the national solidarity. The second issue, the crisis of the parliamentarian democracy. Of course, some changes can also be done at the level of ordinary legislation, but some of the dysfunctionalities of the electoral system, such as for instance that it is not enough proportionated, or the social perception that the politicians are a privileged political class, derive from certain constitutional provisions, such as establishing the province as electoral district, or the establishment of immunities of members of parliaments. And this would require a constitutional amendment. Finally, in order to face the social rights issue, it is also possible a change of the political majority. It is foreseen a possible change of the political majority from today's conservative to a prospective left-wing majority. And this new majority could reorganize the public expenditure and reorient some of the cuttings in the public budget to other fields, to other non-social fields. Or even they could try to increase the public income through more tax pressure. But all this is not always an easy task. And anyway, it will not give response to the aim of many citizens that a certain level of social welfare is legally entrenched against changes. And this can only happen if, through a constitutional amendment, those social rights become authentic fundamental rights.
So it looks like the road leads to a constitutional amendment, but it may not be possible. Do you think that the Spanish Constitution is simply too difficult to amend?
Yes, that's my opinion. According to the constitutional theory modeling of the constitutional amendment, we could say that the Spanish Constitution is an ultra-rigid constitution. This is the consequence of being a post-dictatorship constitution and the fear of the democratic political forces of that time to lose the democratic conquest laid down in the constitutional text. As you sustain in some of your works, we would say that they tried to preserve with the constitutional amendment clauses something that was already established by the new democratic constitution. Looking to the two amendment procedures, the easiest amendment procedure which would be required, for instance, for changing core aspects of the electoral system, such as the size of the electoral districts, would require the agreement of 3/5 of the members of each house, and eventually a binding referendum of the whole nation if 1/10 of the members of each house asks for it. But worse than that, the more entrenched procedure, which for instance would be required for the case of the territorial organization, for the secession of Catalonia, for instance, or for the addition of new social rights to the catalogue of fundamental rights, it would be required even a 2/3 majority of the members of each house twice in a double reading, once before and once after calling for a general election, and then afterwards a mandatory and binding referendum of the whole nation. In general terms, we can say that the Constituent in Spain drafted a so entrenched amendment procedure that is very difficult in normal situation to amend the Constitution without an agreement of the two majoritarian parties. And the electoral system, as I told before, is so set up that the political system is a bipartisan one. So if the two parties are not agreed in the issues to amend, no amendment politically is possible. We can also say that now we are in an extraordinary situation, not in a normal situation. So let's see what happens after the next general election, 2015, and the composition of the parliament after the election.
So perhaps a formal amendment may be possible after all. We'll just have to wait and see. Benito, that ends the questions that I've had for you. But before we go, I'd love to ask you what it is you're working on these days. What are you researching and what are you writing?
Besides resuming my earlier work on constitutional amendment and its limitations, and trying to deliver in this field and other fields some scholarship in English in order to get to more audience, my present research focuses mainly in fundamental rights issues. Fundamental rights of children, the right to education, the presence of religious symbols in public spaces and the freedom of religion that is involved, the democratic framework of citizenship and the exercise of fundamental rights as a core aspect of citizenship, and the relationship between democratic citizenship and multiculturalism in our globalized and highly complex society. Of course, teaching and administrative staff also take a lot of time, but I tell myself every time that I cannot complain about that. At the end, I am being paid for doing what I like with social responsibility. And that's a privilege in many European countries nowadays.
It's a privilege in all parts of the world. I think you and I, Benito, have the best job in the world.
You're right. At least that's what we feel.
Well, thank you very much for helping us understand these very important issues in Spanish constitutional law. And we look forward to reading more of your work. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you to you, Richard.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.